We're looking at what is honestly the ultimate historical survival story. We're talking about how Iran, ruled at the time by the Qajar Dynasty and known globally as Persia, managed to pull off an absolutely incredible feat. If you look at a map from the 19th century, right at the height of the age of imperialism, empires were swallowing up territory literally everywhere you looked. But Persia? Persia somehow stood its ground and avoided direct colonization. So the huge question we need to answer is why Iran was the glaring exception here. I mean, almost all of Asia and the Middle East fell under some form of foreign rule. There were very, very few places that got through this era without being completely conquered. But Iran wasn't conquered, not even briefly, during this specific period of massive imperial expansion. To figure out how they pulled off this geopolitical miracle, we have to look at the massive tectonic shifts in global power that were happening right on their front doorstep. Section 1. The imperial encroachment. Let's start with the Ottoman decline, which created a really dangerous power vacuum right next door. Geopolitics absolutely abhors a vacuum, right? So into this void stepped two new aggressive Goliaths. On one side, you've got the Russian Empire pushing down from the north. They were highly militarized, expanding south and east, seizing actual Persian territory, and embedding themselves as a massive, unavoidable trade partner. Then, on the other side, you have the British Empire. They show up and start aggressively expanding their economic control in the south, clashing with the Qajar Dynasty over some incredibly valuable land. So Persia is suddenly sandwiched right between a military juggernaut and a financial titan. That brings us to Section 2, a high-stakes balancing act and the diplomatic playbook the Qajar rulers used to survive. You see, the Qajar rulers were incredibly pragmatic. They knew they'd be crushed in a direct military conflict. So their playbook looked like this. Step 1, simply acknowledge military weakness. No delusions of grandeur here. Step 2, accept that both of these empires won't stop until they have total control. And Step 3, which is really the masterstroke, play them off against each other. Since Persia couldn't fight them physically, they actively manipulated the rivalry. If Russia pushed a little too hard, Persia would buddy up with Britain. If Britain got too greedy, well, they'd invite the Russians over for tea. It was a brilliant strategy to stay alive. Moving into Section 3, striking black gold and how the oil factor changed everything. This delicate balancing act was actually working until a massive plot twist completely flipped the board. Persia struck oil. And guys, we are not talking about a little puddle. They struck a lot of oil. Suddenly, Persia was holding the ultimate prize, the literal fuel of the future. The stakes skyrocketed overnight. Britain's heavy economic influence basically forced the Persian government's hand, and they ended up signing overall oil rights over to the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And if you're thinking that name rings a bell, you're right. Today, we know that exact company as BP. With all that unprecedented wealth on the table, the tension between Britain and Russia was at a total boiling point. To keep from destroying each other, the two powers signed the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907. This is the closest Persia ever came to actual formal colonization. Basically, Britain and Russia carved the country up into these spheres of economic influence, leaving just a tiny little free zone in the middle. But crucially, because Persia was straddling both spheres, it stopped the country from becoming the sole imperial property of just one nation. So their economy was sliced up, for sure, but the political state survived. Let's look at Section 4, World War I chaos. The geopolitical board gets completely overturned. The chaos of the First World War put Persia's balancing act through the ultimate stress test. In 1914, the Ottomans declare war on the Entente and actually invade and occupy eastern Persia. It was an absolute mess. But then, boom, 1917 hits, a massive shockwave. The Russian Empire completely collapses due to the Bolshevik Revolution, and their forces just pack up and leave Persia. Shortly after that, the Ottoman Empire entirely breaks apart. And that leads us to Section 5, escaping formal colonization, where Britain suddenly stands alone. With the Ottomans shattered and the Russians heading home to deal with their own revolution, Britain was the only superpower left in the room. They immediately swooped in to make Persia an unofficial protectorate. They handed the Persian ruler, Ahmed Shah, extremely heavy-handed treaties, and he agreed to them. Why? Well, as this blunt quote from our source material puts it, he agreed because he didn't feel like dying. He was under massive, undeniable duress. Britain had all the leverage. But the crazy thing is, these treaties wouldn't actually last. Because, out of nowhere, a unified wall of global pushback saved Persia at the 11th hour. The rest of the world saw what Britain was doing and loudly cried foul. The United States protested, France fiercely decried the whole arrangement, and the newly formed USSR called it out for exactly what it was, a thinly veiled annexation. Facing this massive diplomatic heat from literally all sides, Britain was forced to abandon their plans, and they withdrew. Finally, Section 6, the price of survival and keeping independence intact. So Iran survived the ruthless age of imperialism with its borders mostly independent. And really quickly, just a brief aside for the history buffs watching, yes, we know there was a brief military occupation later on during World War II, but that's a completely different era and doesn't count against this specific 19th century colonial survival story. For this specific era of imperial land grabs, Iran was the great exception. But all of this really brings us to a complex conclusion. Persia masterfully played global superpowers against each other to survive. It was undeniably brilliant. But when you consider that they had to hand over so much of their incredible oil wealth and economy just to avoid formal annexation, it really makes you wonder, right? Is a nation truly independent if it has to surrender its economic wealth just to keep its borders intact? It's a